Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Virginia Trioli and we're coming to you live from Melbourne tonight. Joining me on the panel, Independent Member for Indi, Helen Haines, Shadow Attorney General Mark Dreyfus, Business Leader and President of the Melbourne Football Club, the reigning AFL Premiers, Kate Roffey. Joining us from Sydney, Liberal Senator for New South Wales, Andrew Bragg, and writer, director and comedian Craig Reucassel, who's just directed Big Deal, a documentary about political lobbying. And it's great to have you all here, so thank you for coming.
This last-minute scramble by the Liberal National Party to find a policy on climate change just feels like a school kid's had an assignment to do for 3 months and left it to the last day to get it done. Why has it taken 8 years for this government to get their act together on climate change? Thank you.
Let's turn straight to you for that one, Senator Bragg.
Well, thanks, Glenn, for your question. I mean, the plan to get emissions down is a very complex agenda because you've got to decarbonise electricity, you've got to decarbonise industry and transport, and then you've also got to look at agriculture, which is quite complex. And so what you'll see over the next few weeks is an agenda to decarbonise those three things with a target to get to net zero in a particular year. And I think it's important that as part of that agenda, there is a clear checkpoint along the way in 2030 so that global capital markets can see that Australia is serious about getting to net zero.
Why has it taken so long, though? I mean, that's the question went to you leaving it to the last minute like a school child leaving your homework to the last minute. This has been about, of course, bringing all the party, not the party room, but the coalition with you. Are you going to be able to drag recalcitrant national members with you to net zero by 2050?
Well, it's always been the way that before these conferences that there is a discussion and a negotiation. Before the Paris Agreement in 2015, the Abbott and then the Turnbull government agreed there would be a 26 to 28% cut by 2030, and there was a discussion at that time. So this is keeping with our convention as a coalition. That discussion is ongoing, and I think it's a very important one. It's a very important one for regional Australia because a lot of the opportunities will be in regional Australia, from pumped hydro, from hydrogen, from offshore wind. So it's a critical discussion. It's happening now, and it'll be resolved very shortly.
Just before we get to the rest of the panel, just quickly, what do you imagine the interim 2030 target might end up being, the cut?
Well, let's see. I mean, I think it should be 40%. I think that's quite achievable. I mean, the business community thinks it could be higher than that. But I think 40% would be a reasonable target for us to show the rest of the world that we're serious about getting to net zero. And that's so important because we need foreign capital to fund these huge investments in the bush. I mean, the country has never been able to fund itself. We've always relied upon foreign capital. And so, as the Treasurer has said, the external signals we send are critical. Let's go to you, Mark Dreyfus.
I'm going back to Glenn's question, Virginia. This is a rabble of a government. We have waited 8 years. 8 years. Andrew didn't answer the question. We've been waiting 8 years for a government to get on to having a proper policy on climate. We've had 21 policies, all of them abandoned. We're now waiting for the 22nd. You know who we're waiting for? We're waiting for Barnaby Joyce and the National Party to tell the Government of Australia, which they're part of, what the policy is going to be. Federal Cabinet met yesterday, but no one's prepared to talk about what was discussed or even maybe decided because we're waiting until the Nationals Party meet on Sunday. I find this absurd. We had the pre-COP. That's the conference of the parties. It happened in Milan 2 weeks ago. Australia didn't say anything at the pre-COP because we didn't have a policy. And I represented Australia for 2.5 years in the climate talks, working with Greg Combet as my senior minister in the Gillard government. We knew months out what our positions were going to be because we wanted to convince the rest of the world to take action. This rabble of a government have not got a policy and they have let Australia down big time.
Well, let's turn to a little bit of a rabble on your side. I mean, you've had recalcitrants that have held you back on your side as well. Does the departure of Joel Fitzgibbon make your life a little easier now? Because it's not been straightforward from the Labor side either, particularly when it comes to detail.
I don't think anyone's been in any doubt, Virginia, that Labor stands for strong action on climate, that Labor stands for a higher level of ambition, and no one is in doubt that when we were in government for 6 years, we ended that period of government with a comprehensive set of climate policies which were wrecked by the Abbott government. We're now talking about whether the pathetically low ambition, the small targets for 2030, which were set by Tony Abbott's government, that's how long they've been around, should perhaps be increased. Of course they should be increased. The rest of the world is demanding that Australia go to Glasgow and keep the agreement that Malcolm Turnbull made in Paris in 2015, which is that we would go to Glasgow or go to wherever the conference was to be held in 2020, 5 years' time. It got cancelled last year because of COVID disaster in the United Kingdom. And here we are a year later, and this rabble of a government still don't know what Australia's going to say. It's shameful, and the sooner we get rid of this government, the sooner we'll get proper action on climate change.
We'll get to some campaigning of yours if you have to a little later on.
It's an extraordinary situation.
I want to hear from Helen Haines.
Yeah, thanks, Glenn, for the question, and it's a great question. Because fundamentally the government have not had a plan, and we're now in a situation where there's a closed-door secret deal being done at the moment with the National Party and the Liberal Party. I represent an electorate in rural and regional Australia, in Indi, and let me tell you that farming communities, that regional communities are so far in front of the National Party, so far in front of the Liberal Party. Andrew, you talk about opportunities. The opportunities that we have in front of us, if only this government had had a plan 8 years ago, let alone within the last 8 years. I mean, we have the National Farmers Federation who have committed to a zero net emissions by 2050 years ago. We've got the Meat and Livestock Association who've committed to carbon neutrality by 2030. We have the dairy farmers in my electorate just last week sending me their plan for climate action. And we have renewables being built at pace right around regional Australia. Every large renewable project is in the regions, and is the profits coming back to the regions? No, because there hasn't been a plan from the National Party. They're too busy looking backwards, looking for compensation for things that have happened years ago. OK, that was an argument, but where are you taking us into the future? I've put a plan to the government. I put a plan when I came into Parliament as the member for Indi. I worked with the local people in my electorate around a plan for community energy that would see profits coming back into regional towns where we would see a boom. I mean, this could be the greatest thing since the gold rush, the greatest thing since the wool boom, but we've been held back by the coalition, and it's just so disappointing to regional Australia. But I'm really optimistic for us, if only we could get some decent leadership at our federal level.
I want to hear from Kate. I'm going to come back to you, Senator, with a couple of questions, but go ahead, Kate Roffey.
Yeah, look, and I come from, no politics, and I won't cast a vote on who's got the biggest rabble, but on behalf of everyone who consumes out there, could we please actually see some strategy on where our next forms of reliable, renewable, and most importantly, affordable energy is actually going to come from? Because I think there's a lot of talk about who did the wrong thing and which policy we should have, but there isn't enough talk about we're closing down our coal-powered plants. That's fine, but what are we actually replacing them with, so that people who are in a checkout queue with their 4 children and toting up the total of their groceries because they have to leave a 6-pack of sausages or a loaf of bread in their trolley because they can't afford it. Sorry, but saying pop solar on your roof of your house is just not an option for them. So I want to see more of this talk about, realistically, how are we going to transition into this space to support everyone who deserves to have heating in their house in Australia, to have kind of access to reliable and affordable renewable forms of energy.
Craig Reucassel, it's an issue that you've covered comprehensively, climate change and any action taken to mitigate it. What's your response to the question?
Well, it's interesting because polls have shown for a long time that the great majority of Australians want real action on this front. And it's interesting to hear Andrew talk about we've got to respond to the global capital markets and give them a sign. So finally, something that we're listening to. Apparently it's the global capital markets that we're going to listen to rather than polling and, Australia's population. So I'm just glad to see action on any front here. And look, I think it's great that we're focusing at the moment on getting a target there, but how we actually meet that target is really important too. If you say you're going to get 40% by 2030, and that's based on, just expanding fossil fuels, dirty hydrogen, saying we're going to have carbon capture and storage, something we've spent over $4 billion on and pretty much got nothing out of, it's actually also about what the actual things you're going to do are. And look, I agree with Kate. There's a big concern from people on the ground about how am I going to be looked after in this. And I think everybody who's part of this transition should be looked after. But right now, we're kind of the country that's had a lot of technology and, horsepower in the 1910s or something. And we're looking to, should we move into cars? And we're kind of being driven by the people who have got a lot of money in horseshoes. And we're going, no, let's not put anything into cars. Let's just keep going with horseshoes. The reality is, if we actually put money investing into the new technologies, then we will have jobs for people who can go from coal to green hydrogen or something like that. But if we don't do that, they're going to be left out and they're going to be in a worse situation.
Well, on that point, I just wanted to come back to you, if I could, Senator. It was interesting to hear from the International Energy Agency saying that for the globe to achieve net zero by 2050 in terms of emissions, no new gas, coal or oil extraction would be able to take place at all. Is Australia and is the Australian government in a position where they can commit to that? No more gas, coal or oil extraction?
Well, it's a transition to 2050. So if you look at domestic energy production, I mean, it's just not true to say that we're not investing in new ideas, new technologies. I mean, hydrogen, you're going to see 25,000 jobs in hydrogen by 2030 just from Fortescue. You're going to see offshore wind generate 3,000 jobs. You're going to see pumped hydro generate enormous amounts of energy and jobs. So the country is investing in these things. The government itself can't afford to, and no one would expect that Australia's government would be investing in all these different projects. So we do need to get capital markets on side here. I mean, I'm sorry if people think that's a flippant point, but we do need money to make these investments. It is a very expensive transition and it will take a couple of decades.
Well, I don't know if it's a flippant point. I mean, I think the issue really is, isn't it, that capital markets have gone in the direction of renewables for years now, and and I think they've outpaced investment in fossil fuel industries by 25 times. I think Bloomberg reported just the other day. So it's the Australian government that's been chasing behind private equity and capital markets, isn't it? I mean, I don't know why the national members or indeed government members, given that it's a party that is committed to the principles of the free market and the private market, why you haven't believed the market when that's where the money's gone.
I do. I've been there for 2 years and that is my position, very clearly my position. That.
But for the last 8 years, the party hasn't.
Well, I've been there for 2 years and I can tell you that in the 2 years I've been there, I've argued strongly for a market approach to these issues. I've always taken the view, even before I was in Parliament, that environmental risks are the same as any financial risk. They need to be priced into your investment and dealt with accordingly. So, of course, we're on the pathway of a low emissions approach, and I think that's going to give huge opportunities into the bush in particular.
My question is to Andrew and Mark. Helen Haines is on the panel tonight. Could you please explain to her and to us why your party won't support her ICAC bill? Thank you.
I'll start with you, Senator. Why not support the bill that Helen Haines has been working on for quite some time now?
Well, thanks, Ian. And I think you're from Kyla, which is a part of the world I know pretty well. Look, I think that an anti-corruption commission is a good idea. I wouldn't call it a federal ICAC. I'd be very clear about what it is, and it would be about dealing with serious corruption issues. I've been attracted to the Victorian model, which I think does a lot of good work in the background, and then once it's built a good brief of evidence, it can use coercive powers. I think that would be a very appropriate thing for us to have in Canberra.
But why not the bill? The question was, can you turn to Helen and explain to her why her bill won't cut it?
Well, the executive government legislates its agenda. I mean, independents don't legislate. And the government is developing...
Parliament should always be open to an interesting new idea and a new voice, shouldn't it?
Well, but the government is developing an integrity commission. I mean, I would prefer to call it an anti-corruption commission, and that is something that is in the works as we speak.
Oh, well, Mark Dreyfus, Helen's sitting next to you. Tell her why.
We would support Helen's bill, and that's been made clear. I've done a press conference with Helen in which I made that position clear, and we made our position clear in respect of the precursor bill, which Helen's predecessor, Cathy McGowan, tried to bring forward in the Parliament. Every single crossbench member of the Parliament and Labor, and that's why I did a very unusual press conference a couple of years back with, unusually for me, Pauline Hanson and all of the Senate crossbench and all of the House crossbench saying we will support a National Anti-Corruption Commission. If it's Helen's bill, that's fine. And I have to say, the only parties who don't support a National Anti-Corruption Commission, a powerful and independent one, is the Liberal and National Party. So the questioner, unfortunately, has to grapple with the problem, just as Helen and I do, that we're not the government at the moment. To get a powerful and independent National Anti-Corruption Commission, you'll need to have a Labor government, and I'm very much hoping we will get elected at the next election so we can do this, because we've been committed to this.
Let me find out what, Helen, the status of your bill is.
Yeah,
Helen?
well, let me just say first up, the fact that Ian, a member of the public, asks a question about something as technical as an Integrity Commission bill tells you how important it is to the people of Australia.
So what's the status of your bill? Because I think you need a couple of senators, don't you?
I do, and I can say that at that press conference, which all the crossbench senators from both the House and the Senate were present, including Senator Hanson, Senator Patrick, Senator Sterling, and Sterling Griffin, so on. I will be reintroducing my bill to the House. It will be an opportunity for Andrew to be dead serious about this, for other members of the government to be dead serious about this. The bill that I have presented to the House, the government had no desire whatsoever to debate it. Andrew speaks as though this is some kind of far-off idea. We had a Prime Minister who promised us at the last election that he would deliver a Federal Integrity Commission during this Parliament. Well, that was more than 1,000 days ago. All we've seen is a draft plan from the government, no legislation. Indeed, my bill has been judged by Transparency International when they looked at all the integrity commissions around Australia, anti-corruption bodies, as being best practice. The work is there, Andrew. I invite you. Look at it. This, I think, should be taken out of the hands of the big parties. Let's face it, the nation has lost trust in much of our political discourse coming from the major parties.
Okay.
I think a safe pair of hands coming from the crossbench could get rid of that and actually deliver for the nation something they truly want, an integrity commission.
I want to go to Kate and also go back to the Senator as well, but very, very quickly. As I understand it, Helen Haines, in order to get that bill back into the House, you do need to find the support of a couple more senators. Have you, very briefly, have you managed to secure them?
What I have is an opportunity to either reintroduce it to the House of Representatives or bring it through the Senate. And I can tell you that I have the crossbench on both houses supporting my bill.
All right.
We have just one more thing. At the moment in the House, 75-75. It only takes one member of the government to cross the floor.
I don't think you're a big fan of a federal ICAC, are you, Roffey?
I'm not against the federal ICAC, and Craig and I don't want to be ganging up on our elected officials here.
Go right
ahead. I agree. It's so subjective, you know, because it isn't illegal, very clearly defined. That's illegal and that's immoral. And so part of the difficulty I think I have with these sort of entities, and it's what you're talking about, Helen, is they have to be structured up properly. I am all for making sure that morals, ethics and integrity are upheld. That's one of the things I think the public are crying out for. We just want to know that we can trust.
And so you don't see an entity that exists in Australia right now that does that?
My one concern, and I've seen it happen, is I am not a fan of public trial by innuendo. And I think these entities open themselves up for names to be put out there with very little evidence, possibly off the back of retribution in cases, and we all know that once that mud is thrown, it sticks, and you can finish, Mark, quite correctly, you can finish your investigation and you can come through the end of that investigation and say, all cleared, we have found nothing here. But for that person who may have been named in one of these inquiries to polish their tarnished reputation is incredibly difficult out in the court of public opinion. So I would want to see that very, very, very carefully scrutinised and handled properly in these sort of entities. Because
Craig, have you got a response to that? Is there a way through that?
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, I think there is a lot of protections there in these kind of bills and these organisations to actually have to have an enormous amount of investigations prior to actually, you know, bringinging somebody before them.
Which is what Senator Bragg was referring to in ICAC,
Yeah, I don't think that it's true that there's just innuendo thrown out in this. I think that people might get caught up in other people's cases, as happened in New South Wales, but I don't think it's the case that, you know, somebody has been brought before these bodies without enormous amount of investigation, enormous amount of consideration going on to it. And look, in the case in New South Wales with Gladys Berejiklian, a very popular leader in a lot of ways, but I think we should wait and see what evidence comes out of the actual investigation before we make our judgments.
Do you want to make any comment there, Senator?
A bit late for that, though, isn't it? Yeah.
Kate, just one second. Senator Bragg?
Premier Berejiklian's case, isn't it?
I'm inviting Senator Bragg to speak, everyone. Go ahead.
Well, I mean, I'd just say that I think that the Victorian model, where you do the work behind the scenes, hasn't destroyed reputations unnecessarily, whereas in New South Wales, they're much quicker to go to public trials. I think that there is a case for public trials. That's always been a feature of Royal Commission, so I think that could be a feature of a federal body. But I am also conscious of what Kate has said, that we don't want to unnecessarily rub people out of public office without there being a proper process, because it's hard enough to get good people to run for public office to start with.
I'm noting that your colleague MP David Sharma, he's calling for a beefed up ICAC. He said, my view is that some of the referral ability needs to be broadened. The class of people subject to it needs to be broadened out. That's the one, of course, that's been proposed by your government. I think you pretty much agree with that. Do you want to see public servants and also the agencies that might be subject to scrutiny under that? Do you want to see federal politicians and parliamentarians also subject to the same kind of powers and scrutiny?
Oh, for sure. It needs to be focused on corruption. It needs to be focused on where people are using public office for their own benefit or to help their associates. And then, you know, separate to that, you've got integrity measures which already exist, which I think could be beefed up, pecuniary interest standards, ministerial standards and the like. I mean, the pecuniary interest standards, I think, in particular, could be reviewed. I think there are many gaps there. So there's a whole lot of things you could do.
Okay, let's go to...
Could I just respond just to Kate, to reassure you, Kate, that there are remedies to this issue. No one wants to see vexatious claims made against good people. They don't. And certainly the bill that I've worked in partnership with legal experts on has design features about that, so that the Commissioner can throw out immediately any vexatious claims. That, as Andrew said, a considerable amount of work done before it ever gets to an investigation point, and certainly before it gets to a public hearing. And it's so important, though, that like a Royal Commission, that if someone is brought before the Commissioner and there is good cause to do so after that preliminary work, that the public can see what happens and that there is a public report and exoneration if that's
my issue is...
Well, if you want to hear from the questioners, Kate, you'll have to keep it tight.
I get called out and so I appear, probably quite rightly, but I just happened to mention Mark as part of... And all of a sudden that's picked up in the media, and I'm talking about those kind of trials by... innuendo, where there's absolutely no reason other than the fact that I didn't like the suit that Mark was
still
wearing,
the defamation laws that exist and that prevent us from maybe reporting what you've suggested there.
I can reassure you.
The lockdowns have crushed many citizens' savings and their livelihoods. The right to the output of one's labour is the essence of liberty, and the protection of private property is the main reason we have government. So why did our governments destroy so many lifetimes of wealth accumulation and divide us for a virus that has treatments and a vaccine for anyone who felt vulnerable and wanted it? Should Australians who love their freedom as much as their country demand recall elections and better constitutional protection of rights?
Kate, I might get you to respond to that first of all. Yeah,
interesting question. I think when we talk about the pandemic, and I live in Melbourne, obviously, so I've been in the worst lockdown city in the world. To start with, we didn't have a choice. We just couldn't have coped with opening up and allowing people their freedoms because our hospital systems would have been overrun. We didn't have any access to vaccine. We didn't even have a vaccine at that time. And I think at that time it was for our political leaders to say, in the interests of everyone, we will be in lockdown for a period of time. Remember, the whole country was in lockdown to start the COVID environment. We are now vaccinated, and I think this is something that mentally, as a Melburnian, I'm going through at the moment. I've gone through the phase now of realisation we are not going to be a COVID zero state anymore. I've just been in Perth. That is COVID zero. It's astonishing when you've been locked down for so long to
walk another
around,
world, I hear.
To work around with no mask, go to the coffee shop, go and get your hair cut. It's astonishing. But I think we've had to move mentally through this process of almost grieving for what we've lost, grieving for the fact that we won't go back to being a COVID zero state and probably not a COVID zero nation again. We cannot keep our interstate borders shut. And now I'm moving myself personally into this next phase of realisation that I'm going to have to go back out into the world, and I'm fully double vaccinated, have been for months.
And
but
do you feel okay about that?
Pardon?
Do you feel okay about that?
Absolutely, absolutely. I think that protects me. First and foremost, I'm vaccinated. That protects me, hopefully, from getting sick from COVID. So that's the first thing. Secondly, it hopefully helps me stop spreading it to someone else. But I've got to move mentally now into that thing where I will move out into society where the chances are I may very well get COVID. And I think this is it's a mental transition that we have to go through as individuals and as states and cities to actually get to a point where we realise we have to live with this. I will not do another lockdown. I could not, and I'm pretty well off. I work at home.
You'll actually disobey an order if we're put into another lockdown. Is that what you're saying? Civil disobedience here, Kate Roffey?
I just couldn't. I mean, mentally, and I'm in a really great spot. I don't own a small business that's been shut for, the better part of 2 years here in Victoria. So I'm doing fairly well, and mentally I personally couldn't cope anymore. So we have to, absolutely, we've got to move on.
We're running short of time. We have the last question I want to get to. Can I just very quickly, though, go to the rest of the panellists here on that question? And we'll have plenty of time in the years to come to reflect on this. Senator Bragg, did we trade away, as per the question, too many freedoms in order to protect our society? It's unimpeachable that we have ended up in a very good position, Australia, in terms of the loss of life compared to other countries and the dreadful loss of life they've had. Was the price paid too high in terms of freedom, do you think?
That depends on what you do for a job. If you work for government or you work for a large business, then the pandemic may not have affected you all that much. If you're a travel agent or you're a barber or you own a gym, it's been a disastrous couple of years and you won't catch up quickly. And so that's why the government support packages need to be very, very cognisant of the impact on small business.
Okay. Craig?
Yeah, look, I don't think the dichotomy is between, freedom and not, as in that, if we'd had freedom, we would have had total we would have been economically fine. Unfortunately, we were dealing with a virus. And I think, it's been a difficult balancing act for governments. And
do you think they've largely got it right?
To largely, I would say they have. And I think it's interesting that there were periods during this where government trust actually went up. I mean, I've been looking at government trust registers for a long time. This is actually one of the rare times it's gone up. And I wonder if that was part of the reason is every day they were standing up in front of you. They were telling you what was happening all the time, enormous amounts of communication. They were also telling you, they had the person who was advising them right there. They had the medical officer as well.
Yeah.
And it's interesting to compare that to the kind of normality of going, I don't know what's going on. There's something going on behind closed doors. I barely hear this. I barely watch this. I wonder if the reason we had that increase in trust in our governments is because they were right there in front of us telling us what was going on.
Hey, bit of transparency. Look at that. Just quickly, if I can, Mark Dreyfus, we have a question to go to.
We're all sick of lockdowns. Thousands of people have lost their livelihoods and have not been able to work. It's shocking, but lockdowns have saved lives. My complaint is that vaccinations didn't happen fast enough. It was a race. Australians can see that Mr Morrison was wrong to not rush to get us vaccinated because vaccination's getting us out of lockdown now.
Helen Haines?
Well, I represent a border community, so I would say that we got it wrong on some of our borders, particularly our people who live either side of
that should have been more fluid? Absolutely.
We needed more consistency in those regulations, and I would say it's only worth it if everyone comes through the other side. And I'm very concerned about some of our very vulnerable communities in rural and remote Australia, and I mean our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities who are still exposed and unvaccinated.
That's all we have time for. Please, thanks to our panel, Helen Haines, Mark Dreyfus, Kate Roffey, Andrew Bragg and Craig Reucassel. And thank you for all of your great questions. Next week, David Spears will be here and he'll take a look at the long-awaited government plan for a pathway to net zero. Joining the panel, clean tech investor Simon Holmes Court, Shadow Climate Change Minister Chris Bowen and Indigenous Climate Network Director Amelia Telford. And you can join me tomorrow morning on ABC Radio Melbourne bright and early. So stay safe, good night, go well.